Hello, my name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and I'm pleased to open this webinar. But first, an important note about interpretation. Please note that if you require simultaneous interpretation, you can click on the Wordly button on your screen and select the language of your choice. To remove Wordly from your screen, please select Ignore. Si vous avez besoin d'interprétation simultanée, s'il vous plaît, cliquez sur le bouton de Wordly sur votre écran et sélectionnez la langue de votre choix. So let's get going. The Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform to dive into and explore diverse critical policy issues facing Canadian agriculture and food. These webinars and all of CAPI's work is made possible thanks to the support of partners who understand that agriculture and food can do more and that policy plays a critical role in unlocking the sector's full potential. Today's webinar was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. We're also pleased that this webinar is presented in partnership with the Greenbelt Foundation. The webinar will present insights from the Greenbelt Foundation's latest report, Ontario's Greenbelt, the Key to Food Security in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, part of the Visioning the Future of the Greenbelt series. CAPI was pleased to work on the report with the Greenbelt Foundation. Farmland may seem abundant in Canada, but it is a limited resource. Despite being the second largest country in the world, less than 7% of Canada's land is used for agricultural purposes, and Canada is not among the top 10 countries for ag land. That land is also not created equal, with the land and growing conditions very different in different regions. This land helps feed the country and the world, serves as the starting point for a value chain that includes the country's largest manufacturing sector and supports economic growth and Canadians' well-being. Yet it faces mounting pressures, urban expansion, housing demand, rising land values, and climate change all emphasize the need to boost agricultural productivity, production, and sustainability, while recognizing that farmland is a geopolitical asset that strengthens Canadian sovereignty and security, especially in and around Ontario's Greenbelt. Today's discussion will explore how the Greenbelt can support a strong and resilient agri-food system and highlight its economic importance, its role in preserving prime farmland, and its contribution to Ontario's agriculture and food manufacturing cluster. We'll also discuss key challenges, including farmland loss, supply chain volatility, trade disruptions, and climate impacts on agriculture. Join us to learn how land use policies and collaboration can help ensure the Greenbelt continues to support food security, economic growth, and a thriving agri-food sector. But before we begin the discussion, we'd like to hear from you. There's a poll that will show up on the screen. We'd like to hear from you around our question, is the need to protect agricultural land increasing as geopolitical challenges increase too? The choices that we offer you are no, ag land has always been undervalued. No, there are other competing pressures. Yes, it is more important now than before. Yes, farmland has become a geopolitical strategic asset. Please hope that you take a couple of seconds. We'll let some more answers come in, and then we will share the results shortly. And while we're doing that, I'll just encourage everyone to take the opportunity to sign up for CAPI's mailing list, where you can find out about upcoming events and webinars like CAPI's 2026 Agricultural Exchange Conference being held in October in Ottawa. And so we've got some responses in. 56% of people that have answered the question have said that yes, farmland has become a geopolitical strategic asset. The next largest group, a third of people, are saying yes, it's more important now than it is before. And very few, about 10% of our answers, have said that either that there are other competing pressures, or no, ag land has always been undervalued. And with that, and now that we've heard from you, we'd like to start by hearing from our opening panel. I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Elise Bigley, who will start the conversation today.
Perfect. Thanks, Tyler. So to start off today's webinar, they'll be joining us shortly. I'll be having a conversation with Ed McDonald, Chief Executive Officer of the Greenbelt Foundation, and Margaret Zafirio, Research Fellow at CAPI and author of the latest Greenbelt report. In this conversation, we'll be discussing the work of the Greenbelt Foundation and what they're doing currently, and highlight some of the findings for the report to set the stage for the panel discussion that will follow. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce our two guests. Edward McDonald has been Chief Executive Officer of the Greenbelt Foundation since 2017, leading work on climate resilience, outdoor recreation, local food, and natural spaces. He brings over 20 years of experience in public policy and nonprofit leadership. Ed has served as an advisor to Ontario's Minister of Finance, leading initiatives in consumer protection, access to capital, and financial services. Ed grew up in rural Eastern Ontario, and his grandparents sold fruit in grown in what is now the Ontario Greenbelt to producers such as E.D. Smith. So that experience informs his focus on strong farm economies, protected landscapes, and access to local food. Then we have Margaret Zaffirio, who probably needs little introduction on this platform. She's a agricultural professional with a career as an economist and policy analyst, formerly with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Her most recent experience has involved consulting work for industry on trade, biodiversity, and livestock innovation issues. She has consulted with the Edmonton Regional Metropolitan Board on its long-term growth plan and related land use policies. And as Senior Research Fellow at CAPI, she has completed several projects on climate change in agriculture, externalities, competing pressures on land use in Canada, and productivity and competitiveness of the Canadian food and beverage processing sector. So welcome, Ed and Margaret. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Ed, I'm going to start with you and let you set the stage. So can you walk us through the Greenbelt Foundation's role in preserving the Greenbelt? Really, what does it do, and what inspired this report and how it fits into your broader work at the foundation?
Yes, thank you, Elise. And maybe where I'll actually start is with the Greenbelt itself, which when it was established, it incorporated over, and there's a bit of a map of the agricultural land inside of the larger Greenbelt area. So when it was incorporated or established, the Greenbelt included 750,000 acres of prime agri land here in South Central Ontario. So that's 750 of a little over 2 million acres today. And one of the key things to note about the Greenbelt plan area is that agriculture from a land use perspective is intended to be the predominant land use in the Greenbelt, and the Greenbelt's often referred to as a working landscape. So those agricultural lands represent about 40% of the total Greenbelt area, which also includes some iconic natural features like the Niagara Escarpment and the Oak Ridges Moraine, along with many areas that are extremely important from a water resource perspective and natural systems, which support amazing green spaces, biodiversity, and other things here in this area of Ontario. Also from an agricultural perspective, and it may be a little bit hard to see on this map, but there are two specialty crop areas within the Greenbelt. So the Niagara grape and tender fruit area in the south west corner of the Greenbelt, and then Holland Marsh in the sort of north central, let's call it, area of the Greenbelt. So two specialty crop areas amongst the larger set of systems and landscapes that are agricultural areas in the Greenbelt. And these are really extremely highly specialized growing areas with unique conditions. And maybe we'll talk a bit more about that as we go forward. So the Greenbelt Foundation, which works to act as a steward of the Greenbelt, and we're really lucky in Ontario. There's Greenbelt-like areas all around the world. But ever since the Greenbelt was created in 2004, 2005, the foundation's been in place and has been really trying to work to steward, enhance, and get the most out of the Greenbelt for Ontario. And that we've always put agriculture and agri-food as a central focus of our work, again, to try to enhance what the Greenbelt can provide. So what does that mean? So it involves broad range of work, which includes things like supporting knowledge and capacity development through our grants program, undertaking, we call it applied knowledge and research. So really practical knowledge development and research to inform opportunities and support work that's being done in the agricultural sector and in agricultural communities. And, especially programs like we have now, a big soil health program. And ultimate goal here is really support the economic and social viability of what is extremely valuable, but also near urban agriculture that exists in and around the Greenbelt. The report itself really was inspired by our ongoing interest in highlighting the unique importance of the agriculture that happens in and around the Greenbelt, and particularly in a context of competing land uses, growing populations, impact of climate change here in Ontario and Canada, but also internationally. So we wanted to put some issues in context and wanted to see if this report could support that. Our premise was really agriculture in Ontario and in the Greenbelt in Southern Ontario, particularly important, becoming more important. And we're also looking at it there's intended to be a 10-year review of the Greenbelt plan and the related plans. So what's the vision? What should be a future vision of the Greenbelt as it relates to agriculture and agri-food? So we're hoping the report would sort of support that thinking as well. And what does it mean? It means what should we be thinking about in terms of what we need to protect, what do we need to grow, what are the unique advantages, but also what do we need in terms of policies and investments. So I would also say subsequent when we started this report, we started to see, immense economic and trade issues. It just reinforced the thinking that we need to think about agriculture and agri-food as an immensely important strategic benefit and asset for both Ontario and Canada. So in our view, the Greenbelt sits at the heart of that opportunity, and we're hoping the report kind of generates some further thinking.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks for that, Ed. And we'll get into the report when we bring in Margaret and talk a little bit about the recommendations. And you touched on this a little bit, and I want to know, so the Greenbelt has a relatively small footprint in Canada compared, the land use. What makes this area so unique, and why should it be a priority? Why should we pay attention to this area? And Margaret, I'll follow up with you after once Ed responds.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, the Greenbelt represents, quote, only 6% of Ontario farmland. Not to drown you in too many stats, I will give you a few, which I think tell the tale a little bit. So you have 6% of Ontario's farmland in the Greenbelt, but there's 5,000 farms, which is almost 9% of Ontario farms. And Greenbelt agriculture represents 53% of fruit acreage and 11% of vegetable acreage and 46% of nursery acres. So you're very disproportionate. On average, Greenbelt farms and agricultural operations, because of their unique advantages, generate 68% more revenue per acre on average. Beyond those stats, which talk about the disproportionate impact. I mean, the Greenbelt sits at the center of Ontario's processing capacity. So for growers, you're next to nearly 60% of the total Ontario processing capacity. And of course, next to the largest consumer market in the country. And despite recent challenges, close to export opportunities in the United States. So what that translates into is billions of dollars in contributions to GDP, tens of thousands of full-time jobs. And maybe the final note is the Greenbelt itself has been very successful in protecting farmland because of its nature. So our research is that since 2005, prime ag land conversion with the Greenbelt has averaged about 2 hectares a year relative to 900 hectares a year across the rest of Ontario, which is a bit of a stunning stat. So the unique growing conditions, access to water, climate, the pros and cons of near urban, and are among the things that just make this, yes, small area, but extremely important area of the larger agricultural system in Ontario.
Yeah, so the statistics are actually very helpful. I'm viewing it as it's a very small footprint with a huge return on investment.
Yeah.
Over to you, Margaret. Why should we care about the Greenbelt?
Well, I mean, like Ed has provided all the statistics you need there. I lived in Southern Ontario, and I'd often visit parts of the Greenbelt and very important Class 1 prime agriculture land, and you just hate to see it being eaten up by development. So the Greenbelt, because of the Greenbelt, as Ed mentioned, you've been able to preserve that and protect it from development. I mean, there still is development. There has been development. This is the problem. It's a balance, right? I mean, you want to maintain agriculture, you want to have rural lands, but on the other hand, you also need the economic development. So the Greenbelt provides that, as Ed mentioned. This area is a very important food industry cluster in North America. The University of Waterloo claimed that it was the third most important food industry cluster. Food industry clusters are important because what they require is a combination of research institutions, education, plants, distribution centers, all of these components, business entrepreneurs. You need all these things in one spot, and by being together, it strengthens the output that they're able to produce. And that has been so important in the Greenbelt area, Toronto, Hamilton, over to Kitchener, Guelph. I mean, such an important food industry cluster in Canada and certainly in Ontario. So, but the pressures have been incredible. Population pressures, the housing pressures, um, uh, on development. And so the Greenbelt has allowed by having this framework, you've been able to ensure that it's sort of a managed development at the same time as you're able to continue to benefit and leverage the wonderful agriculture land, the agribusinesses, the farmers that are in the Greenbelt, the food industry players. As Ed mentioned, specialty crops in this, that a diversity of agriculture production that you don't get almost anywhere else in Canada, with the tender fruits, the vineyards, the dairy, the livestock, the crops, and everything else. So that's why it's a priority to maintain it, preserve it, leverage it, and benefit from it, especially in these times of geopolitical disruptions and the trade issues.
So, Margaret, I'm going to turn to you and kind of get us right back into the report. So, as the report's author, what did we learn? So, what stood out from the findings? And I know there's a number of recommendations, but what should our stakeholders be paying closest attention to from what we found in the report?
Well, I mean, like Ed has provided some of the statistics, and there's a fair amount of number of statistics in the report to sort of back up the evidence of the importance of the agriculture and agri-food component of the Greenbelt. But really, one of the things that we learned is that the Greenbelt is really a strategic asset, like Ed mentioned. It's really important for our future. We have to maintain it, we have to preserve it, we have to leverage it, and it's important to make use of this asset and to make the best of it. One of the things that I discovered by focusing on the Greenbelt, because of course it could apply to a broader area of Southern Ontario or other parts of Ontario, but this Greenbelt is a really important framework for protecting the land, preserving, but developing at the same time, economic development. And it's just one of the tools that can be used in land use planning. Other provinces have different mechanisms. The British Columbia has its Ag Land Reserve. Quebec has its, Protection des Territoires Agricoles. But so this is an important tool that we have here in Ontario to preserve this precious area. And certainly there have been pressures and there's been policy changes, but because of added the Greenbelt Foundation and other organizations such as the Ontario Farmland Trust and people who are concerned about land use planning, we've been able to make people aware of its importance. And hopefully this report that Cappy did with the Greenbelt Foundation does just that, makes people more aware of the importance and why it's so important to preserve this area in the Greenbelt.
Yep. Thanks, Margaret. So final question for us before we bring the rest of the panel on for that dialogue. Looking to the future, what's next? So if you could identify one critical next step that should be done in and around the Greenbelt or in land use planning more broadly to better support, grow, and leverage Canada's agri-food potential, what would that one thing be?
Me or Ed?
Sorry, you first, Margaret. We'll let Ed have the last word.
Well, I mean, the one really looking forward, I think it's really important to focus on this agriculture and agri-food component in the Greenbelt. What do we need to do to sort of strengthen it, strengthen our capacity? And there's things that are happening, at the federal level, at provincial level, investment in infrastructure, investment in research and innovation, getting rid of those interprovincial trade barriers so that perhaps there can be more east-west trade, so that there's the demand will help boost agriculture and agri-food production in the Greenbelt.
And Ed, over to you for the last word. Does that align with kind of your one thing? Where is your thinking on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's just immense potential, and we've seen that, but we need to create the opportunity space, and we need complete agricultural communities. We need to support farmers, ag operators, and think about what we're doing that makes it easier or harder to farm and run agricultural opportunities. But if we can do that through policy and investment and other approaches, there is just an immense amount of opportunity, but it won't come without, careful attention and some real thoughtfulness.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. And I want to thank Margaret and Ed for joining me for the opening conversation and for really helping to set the stage for the panel discussion. And with that, I'm going to pass things back over to Tyler to moderate the next portion of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Elise, and again, thank you to Margaret and Ed for setting the stage. What I'd like to encourage everyone to do is to take advantage of our Q&A function that's there. This is a great way to let us know what some of your questions are, and we will get to that later on during the Q&A session with the panelists. We've got 3 panelists today. I'm going to bring them all in, introduce them one at a time, open up the discussion with each of them, and then bring them all in together. Our first panelist this afternoon is Gordon Stock. Gord grew up on a farm near Tavistock, Ontario, where he remains involved, focusing on cash crops. He spent 15 years in nonprofit and government roles on program delivery and policy development, including roles at the Ontario Farm Products Marketing Commission, the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and the Agricultural Adaptation Council, working on regulated marketing, policy, business risk management, and industry funding programs. But Gordon, now you are at Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers, and that is what I would like to start with. Maybe actually just a real basic question, because I think sometimes we don't appreciate fruit and vegetable growers in this country. What are Ontario fruit and vegetable growers? What does that look like across the province, and how is it different in and around the Greenbelt area?
Thank you, Tyler. It's, I think, one of the best way to, if I were to sum it up in one word, we're talking diversity. The province is growing, approximately 120 different fruit and vegetable and related crops across the province, and so that's it's a great strength, but also a great weakness from the standpoint of being able to sort of provide the best sort of economic conditions for each one of those growers and what they contribute to the economy. I think, just as a quick description, the production is of fruits and berries and related crops, grapes, etc. You're going to find close to shorelines and bodies of water that can help moderate those temperatures, especially through the winter time, to support plant viability. But then vegetables, and you're going to find more broadly across the province. Specific to the Greenbelt, a great portion of the fruit production is in the Greenbelt in the Niagara region and along Lake Ontario, North Shore, east of Toronto and so on, and towards Georgian Bay. But also there is significant vegetable production in those areas, with the marsh being a central component of the Greenbelt as well.
And there's a reason, Gordon, right, that we like so I'm in Western Quebec. I don't see a bunch of peach trees around me. Again, can you just kind of drill into kind of why kind of this reality that all farmland's not equal?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from a fruit and vegetable perspective, there's growers are definitely looking for sort of specific, unique features, and whether that's specific soil types or soil conditions. I mentioned the sort of moderation effect of the Great Lakes, and so that's where fruit trees, especially tender fruit, apples can be a bit more hardy, but you're going to find those close to shorelines and so on. The marsh I mentioned is, it's known for its root vegetables and so on. I will say, I'm learning more and more about what's going on in Northern Ontario and the Clay Belt, which is becoming more and more of a discussion point from a public and policy perspective. But there are opportunities up there for certain vegetables as well, like hardier storable crops like potatoes and so on. So there are options outside of the green belt, but there's a lot of opportunity in terms of what's going on in the green belt. I mean, even just sort of different slopes can be in terms of field topography and so on, can be beneficial for land, for air drainage, in terms of getting rid of that cold air and on those frosty spring mornings.
Right, but as much as there is opportunities outside of it, right? I think we see this across the board in agriculture, that we do have a lot of kind of untapped potential. It's not like it's not substitutable, right? You can't take a land in and around the Niagara Escarpment and take whatever ag production is happening there and move it 100 miles inland, right? That's just doesn't work that way.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think you're not going to be growing peach trees in the north or anything like that. That's absolutely the case, and from a temperature and topography standpoint, it's probably not feasible, and maybe in 100 years, depending on how climate change goes. But we do need to be cognizant of our ability to produce these products and these crops today and now, and there is a substantial economic drive, as what Ed and Margaret were talking about earlier, in terms of having those that production down in Southern Ontario and being close to market, and whether that be the domestically or for export.
Right, and we'll get into that kind of the rest of the value chain with our second two panelists, but just staying with farmers to wrap things up with you to open things up. And what are the pressures or what are the dynamics playing out on fruit and vegetable farms in Ontario, especially those in kind of in that southwestern Ontario, or that I guess that would be, does that count as southeastern Ontario? Maybe I don't know my geography well enough, but in and around the Greenbelt area, like what are the pressures? What are the opportunities look like? How does that playing out on farms?
Yeah, so I think I mean, just from a general sort of input cost and revenue side, the farms are being stressed and pressured substantially. The obvious example in more recently is this conflict with Iran, and the challenges it's creating for fuel costs and fertilizer costs, etc. And that's the immediate sort of issue. But I think more broadly, that's the pressures that our growers are facing right now are longer term and mounting. Labor costs, not obviously there needs to be a fair wage and so on, but the cost of housing foreign workers on farm is increasing. The challenges with municipalities to build that on farm housing is an example. Energy costs for heating greenhouses, those are real and mounting challenges. And then on the revenue side, competition is fierce in the sector from the standpoint of imports, and frankly, where growers are competing with other regions who are funded better at the government level from a subsidization standpoint. I mean, even The US put close to $4 billion into its specialty crop growers in the last year, and we don't have any kind of programming that would match that. I mean, we definitely have programming available, but there is a substantive gap. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Gordon. And again, we'll come back to some of those questions around, again, I think this broad theme around resilience and kind of the strategic asset that's there. But we'll bring in our next panelist first, and that is Dr. Amy Prue. Amy is a professor and the academic program coordinator of culinary innovation and food technology at Niagara College. It's been on secondment as the college's global research and innovation systems leader. She's founder of the NSERC-funded Technology Access Center for Food and Beverage Innovation at Niagara College, which supports small business capacity building for innovation and continuous improvement, and is the co-leader in the Sustainable Food Systems for Canada National Network, looking at education for sustainable agri-food sector innovation. Amy, farming firsthand. You do this in your free time too, but you work in food innovation and value added, and that's where I want to try and start today. What does that kind of role around? What role does primary production play in that value added sector? And what are the possibilities that are created in value added food and the food innovation because of that production that's happening in that part of Ontario?
I really liked how Margaret prefaced it in that this region of Ontario is the critical mass for agri-food systems. And when you've got that critical mass of all these different resources, there's so much scale and efficiency that we're able to have. And that relates back to affordability for Ontarians to be able to purchase these products. Innovation is such a delightful and wonderful thing to think about. Within agriculture, there's been so much interest in intensification and being able to get optimization for the land use. But I just made a comment in the Q&A about there are certain crops that we are never going to be able to intensify. Certain things like tree crops, fruit crops like apples, peaches, tender fruits. We are, in my lifetime, I do not anticipate we are going to be turning these into closed system agriculture crops. We have to be really cognizant of the value that we have from protecting land to be able to produce this. And I know a few of the panelists have spoken about the importance of sovereignty. Right now, as the Canadian government is doing an agricultural and agri-marketing diversification program, and it's really important for us to think about what some of the values of our Canadian production are. I live in the Niagara region, and we have some of the cleanest energy available to us. And when we're starting to ask questions about diversification of markets, if we're looking at places like the European Union, where greenhouse gas mapping and life cycle analysis is really important part of the marketing and ability to sell products, we have some of the ideal situations when it comes to clean energy and optimized life cycles for these products. Innovation I also like to think of innovation not just from what are the products that we're making, but what are the services that we're providing? And I know that agricultural tourism is another aspect that hasn't been discussed yet on this panel. Down in the Niagara region, it is absolutely critical as part of our economic development to have agricultural tourism. We have 13 million visitors, and we know that the Niagara region and the Parks Commission has been really deliberately looking at high-value premium tourism as part of their growth strategy. And agriculture is part of that. Wineries, orchards, culinary tourism, these are all really extremely critical parts of the success for this. The Greenbelt is absolutely essential for that, for us to be able to succeed at this tourism. Pardon me, I'm having a moment with my words.
No, that's okay. And again, it's interesting because Gordon talked about some of those pressures that farmers are facing, right? And looking at how do you deal with pressures on the income side and on the expense side, and looking at more of these higher margin opportunities is unique. It's also worth flagging. I think we often talk a lot about how do we talk to the public more, getting the public more in ag lands and out seeing what primary production looks like. We talk about ag tourism as kind of a very positive thing for the farmers that are there, but there's this really broader benefit to the sector, right? When we've got more of that engagement with people getting out of Toronto and getting into the ag lands around it.
Exactly. That if we want to be able to protect agricultural lands, we need to be bringing an intrinsic and emotional value to it. And agricultural tourism is, I think, a really meaningful way of doing that. The Niagara region is a wonderful experience for this. Right now, it's blossom season, and there's so many festivals where individuals are able to go and observe cherry blossoms or fruit blossoms in orchards. That's also a value add for many of these farmers. These are working farms that are going to be, at a later point in the season, having crops that are going to the different cooperatives and sale and distribution or further processing within Ontario. But by having agricultural tourism and culinary tourism as part of that scenario, we're diversifying the value across multiple seasons and just equally increasing the value with the voting public so that they appreciate the value of protecting agricultural land.
And I think the way that we think about that value and almost kind of some of the emotional attachment to these things is changing because of everything else that's changing in the world today. You know, like I think we think of this more in a geopolitical context than we used to. Margaret spoke about how the report highlights that in the North American context, that Greater Toronto area is the third largest kind of food hub. Can you just go back to kind of talking about what does that mean and what does that look like, right? Because it is farmers and it is farmland, but there's a lot of other things that are in the mix as well.
Well, if we look at the stats, it's estimated that 1 in 8, 1 in 9 people in Ontario are working in some form of the agricultural food value chain. And from an employment and economic development perspective, that's really critical. Every person in this world is involved in the agri-food system in some form. Most of us as consumers, but from an employment perspective, it's absolutely critical. From a manufacturing perspective in Ontario, we are constantly, from a food manufacturing perspective, in the battle against the automotive. At this point, we likely are the largest manufacturing sector, and with the current geopolitics, I'm watching increased opportunity for Ontario manufacturers to be fulfilling import replacement. But going back to the question, what does this cluster mean? It means that you've got that whole ecosystem of services. So by having a critical mass of infrastructure in place, whether that's food packaging or research facilities, education, workforce development, the food service, the retail sector, distribution, all of these elements being in close proximity to each other and having that community of practice in close proximity to each other means that we are extremely efficient. And that then allows for scalability and efficiency and affordability for the consumer in the end.
Great. Appreciate that, Amy. So we'll pick some of these themes back up in a minute. I'll bring the final panelist in, and that final panelist is Steve Duff. He's the chief economist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Agribusiness. Prior to his current role as chief economist for 15 years, Steve was a MAFA's lead on business risk management programs. He's chaired several federal, provincial, territorial committees and has looked at things like BSE response and is currently co-chair of the Farm Income Forecasting Committee and sits on the Ag Statistics Committee. Steve and his wife, in their free time, also operate a beef and cash crop operation near Colborne, Ontario. Steve, let's drill into some of the economics of this. I think that there's been a lot of numbers thrown kind of out so far, but can you bring these numbers to life for us around the economic impact of the value chain that grows from in and around the Greenbelt and the farmland in and around the Golden Horseshoe?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler, for having me on today's panel. Yeah, to build on some of the previous comments, the Greenbelt area is significant for a variety of reasons, in the neighborhood of $3 billion in GDP, supported by the agricultural production in that area, close to 48,000 people working in the agri-food value chain from farm to fork, that ecosystem that was just referred to. So it's significant. It certainly punches above its weight. And I think that in that context, it provides a support structure that is also, this sort of goes beyond that set of information. Specifically that the agricultural production, which is very unique in that, in particular in the Niagara region, as was mentioned, has a support structure that supports producers throughout the rest of the province. Producers that are apple producers in the eastern part of the province or farther north that is not part of the Greenbelt are supported by the infrastructure for wholesale packaging, et cetera, within that, right? And again, in some respects, there's sort of concentric layers around the GTA that kind of go even beneath the Greenbelt, out into the Greenbelt, et cetera, whether it's in food manufacturing, et cetera. This is the largest food manufacturing area in Canada, one of the largest in North America. It does go back to the idea that this broader area, again, around the hub of Lake Ontario is so productive, and that's one of the reasons, in combination with the water transport, why we've had such a massive population develop there. But to build on the points that were made earlier, the reality is that this is a very unique growing area. Gordon mentioned 120 crops. We often talk in the ministry, we produce over 200. The 120 that Gordon's referring to is sort of embedded in that. Those are unique to Ontario. There's not a lot of places outside of BC in this country that can produce those things. Those are significant from the perspective of food security for Canadians, as is, the emphasis in this paper. And I think, again, the recognition really goes unsaid that, in the case of peaches, as an example, there's very few places in this country where you can grow peaches. Canadians do demand peaches, as an example. But the ability to keep that land in production for peach production, not just to have it there from an agricultural perspective, because again, I have a son who lives in Vineland, and you're seeing peach orchards pulled out right now. It could have corn and beans in it next year. It doesn't mean the land might not be farmed, but it's not necessarily farmed in that way in terms of this idea. And we were growing tree fruit production in this country at a really rapid rate before we entered into the Custa Agreement in 1989. And all of the gains that we had in tree fruit production in terms of acres fell after that point. And the point about the Greenbelt being significant from an ecosystem is true, and that ecosystem does offer those businesses within that area, either in terms of primary production, processing, wholesale value added, and ability to have some scale. But we are still small internationally in that regard. And so to Gordon's earlier point, we're price takers. If you're an apple grower in the Greenbelt, your ability to compete with Washington State, which is the second biggest apple producing area in the world, is challenging. So it's the ecosystem, the agritourism, the direct-to-consumer, that kind of thing that's really been particularly important, in addition to the fact that it's a unique growing area and you can't grow those things elsewhere in this country, really. And I think a lot of times it goes beyond farmland protection. It goes beyond sort of the basic policy around it. Does the market reward producers in a way that will incent them to continue doing that? As was mentioned by Amy, you can't innovate your way out of some of these industries, right? And as a result, it becomes extremely difficult to continually become more cost competitive in some of these sectors when you don't have thousands of acres of peaches for a single farm, for example. And so that to me is the really unique thing about it, the high value add. And again, recognition that, again, it's generally an area where there's smaller land holdings. Those smaller land holdings do in many respects present themselves towards this type of production, right? If you're going to be a competitive grain and oilseed producer in the area, you need potentially thousands of acres, and that's hard to compile. So the structure of the area from a land perspective is conducive to this. But this challenge of trying to generate a return that keeps this a long-term business is challenging. And to have to go beyond, a lot of producers, even in this industry, would like to be a commodity producer. They don't necessarily want to have to be making pies. They don't want to necessarily have to have people doing a new pick. It's a real challenge economically for people to continue adding those value points, even though they're very real and very beneficial. It's not necessarily for everyone, right? And that's been, I think, one of the challenges for the area as you take on those additional value points, and it comes with additional risks and costs that are challenging for many in the sector.
But Steve, you said something a minute ago about how this goes beyond farmland protection. And I think one of the things that I've learned as Cappy's gotten more involved in land use issues over the years is that we really do often treat farmland protection as a land use municipal planning issue. And I think what our report tries to do, and I think is relatively clear, and especially in this area in Ontario, is that really what it is the start of a very complicated chain and a kind of a very connected set of issues. So when you talk about kind of this goes beyond farmland protection, kind of what's in your mind as you're thinking about this, and what are kind of the other systems that are needed to make sure that we've got a thriving ag sector that's really taking advantage of this this unique land and space that's there?
Well, I guess from my perspective, as somebody that farms pretty actively, and we own land that's specialty crops, so I have some perspective in that regard too. Again, I think a lot has to do with the idea that most farmland can grow some of the larger commodities that we have, right? 6 million of our 9 million acres in production in this province is corn, soybeans, and winter wheat, right? So in theory, much of this land, again, I use the Vineland peach example, it could grow corn and soybeans, grow it pretty well, right? But it isn't necessarily from the perspective of food security or from the perspective of import displacement or from the perspective of market share in horticulture. It's net best use. Now, best use is a relative term, right? From the individual farmer's perspective, your land rates give you the opportunity to do a lot of different things with it. I think that from my perspective, where I'm saying it goes beyond land protection, it's how do we help people have the tools, incentives, and resources to get the most out of that land in that context, right? And that to me, again, in the context of the Greenbelt, and there's other areas in the province to the east, if Prince Edward County might be an example from a wine perspective, even just, east of the Greenbelt, and Northumberland County could be an example. There's other parts of the province as well. How do you get the most out of that? And again, recognizing that not all land is created equal. And I think, again, going back to your earlier comments, while all land largely will support some level of base production, it's what's its maximum use that's often, I think, missed in the equation.
Great. And so let's bring Gordon back in, and let's bring Amy into this conversation as well. And to the audience, please do take the opportunity to put some questions into the Q&A. We appreciate those that have come in. Gordon, we'll go back to you just on Steve's comment about getting land to that kind of that best possible use, making sure that we're getting it there. I mean, you talked about some of the pressures that farmers are facing, but if we really want to unleash the full potential of this land for this higher value crop production today, this higher value fruit and vegetable production, what are the things that you think that we need to change to really let that happen?
Well, I think there needs to be recognition to Steve's point about, that best use. So, and ideally that farm is receiving sufficient, recognition through revenue to be able to justify maintaining those fruit trees or vines or whatever the case may be. I think the we've been trying to push sort of the economic value of maintaining that over corn and soybeans and wheat, because I also think that, and nothing against corn, soybeans, and wheat, I grow that myself, but I think there is a greater economic output from that fruit production, and when you think about the labor that goes into it, and it's substantial. Yeah, there does need to be greater recognition for that, but then also, and some of that is through servicing. So there's farms inside and outside the Greenbelt that are trying to, do more with the land that they have and the farm operations they have through value added, and whether that value added is making pies or branding and packing potatoes and other produce in a sort of more, in a sort of subsequent step to just harvesting, the ability to get sufficient electricity and natural gas to fund those to operate those activities is nearly impossible. It can be done, but the dollars involved are substantial, and the farm ends up investing into infrastructure that is not on their property and they don't actually own. So the ability to finance that is really difficult.
And Amy, I'll come to you on this next, but Gordon, what do you say to those that think that actually the best use of this is to put some houses on it or to develop it for other industrial uses?
My personal view is it's a bit short-sighted when we're talking about food production and back to best use. If we want, as a society, we want to be able to have a fruit and vegetable sector, especially, and I know we keep using sort of the peach example, but I think it's fruit in general requires more specific conditions than other crops. But if we see that as valuable as a society, and I believe we should, then we should be putting the land that we have available to that as dedicating it to that activity and making sure that it can continue with the other policy supports that help that along, given the pressures that farmers are facing.
Right. And Amy, how do you answer this question around kind of these other non-agricultural uses, and how do we do the math around best use that way?
I like where Gordon's going in that best use aspect. We need to be looking longer term. We can't eat houses, but bigger challenge is it's really difficult to attract youth and younger people to agriculture because one, succession planning. If you were a farmer looking to retire out and asking your children to take over that farm, you can't necessarily force their hand and say you have to farm this property. And so the other element being, if we look at land prices, if you were to put that out for housing development as compared to agricultural use, if you are looking at creating an inheritance for your family, the housing development is extremely tempting. And so we have to have some sort of strategic financing for young farmers. I don't know whether that's through the private sector or through government, but to be able to allow younger farmers to be able to afford to purchase land, to be able to go into this business, because right now it's just unsurmountable for most young people to want to be able to purchase meaningful quantity of agricultural land.
Right. And so Amy, you're getting at this question or this kind of point that protecting ag land in and of itself isn't kind of a perfect solution to the problem. You still need to be able to create conditions. Again, there are these pressures that are driving land values up, right? So one of the questions that's come in around kind of what's the level, what's the perspective on the current quality of the greenbelt protection? Is the status quo for protecting ag land enough, or should the protection increased? And maybe again, I'll add on that, picking up on your comment a minute ago. Are there other things that we should be looking at to really take advantage of the potential that's here, and to make sure that we're not just protecting the land, but we've got the right conditions and support for it? So, yeah, go Amy. Amy, go first.
Inevitably, we have to look at the Greenbelt as part of the Ontario and the Canadian ecosystem as well. And that, are there other elements of agricultural intensification that we could be doing on perhaps other zones of land? There's been commenting about the Northern Clay Belt in the Q&A. Inevitably, we keep going back to the peaches. You can't grow peaches in Sudbury. It's just not going to happen. But there's other agricultural zones that perhaps could go through intensification. Now, there was another question also about the use of greenhouses, and closed environment agriculture, I think, has a really important strategic role. We're now using agricultural land not just for, let's say, 5-6 month growing season, but we're using it upwards of 10 to 12 months of the year for incredibly intensive yields on a meter square basis. And the other piece of the puzzle is that there's a lot of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, about greenhouses. But we have to be appreciative of the fact that when you're putting in an incredibly intensified agricultural system, you are then releasing other agricultural lands for other optimized use. And so there is, again, going back to my previous comment, how do we increase appreciation and value within the general public to understand this is an important part of our sovereignty. It's an important part of our culture to be able to have high quality agricultural products and food products available to us.
And so, Gordon, what are your thoughts on this question around greenhouses and kind of other like food production uses that are not kind of farmland uses?
So, I failed to talk about greenhouses in my opening comments, because they are a very significant and important part of the fruit and vegetable sector in Ontario. And I tend to look at it as I really like how Amy talked about that trade-off, and actually the benefit of how growing more in the greenhouse means that we've got other options and more flexibility with other land. And greenhouses also do require specific siting, not there's a number of factors that are involved. One is access to energy, but then the other is light. And please don't test me on this, but my understanding is that, and I know this is outside the Greenbelt, but the concentration of greenhouses in Leamington, Kingsville area is a result of the level of light that area receives. It's a very unique feature, and that's what makes it so successful. So, like it too requires specific site conditions to be able to benefit from that, and I understand and appreciate the concerns that may arise, and there is that NIMBYism for sure, but there is that they can produce nearly 12 months a year if they aren't producing 12 months a year, and there's a huge support that's created by our own domestic food sovereignty, but then also the economics and impacts of the exports that we can drive from that sector as a result. And that's where the majority of our exports come from our for our sector is actually the greenhouse sector.
And Steve, I wonder if you could a quick comment on that, because I do think it's been interesting. There's been greenhouses kind of in the talk a bit lately. The Prime Minister talked about changing the tax treatment for greenhouses a couple of weeks ago when he made a food security announcement. But I think that this kind of understanding that, especially in that Leamington area, greenhouses, that's an export business. It's something that we don't fully appreciate when we talk about greenhouse production in Canada. You want to comment on that and the role that sector plays and the markets that it's serving?
Yeah, so our greenhouse sector all across the province is extremely important, and as you mentioned, Leamington area, because of that sun intensity is really quite significant. Now, again, it's also proximity to the U.S. It is an export-oriented industry, generally speaking. Again, from a dollar per square foot or dollar per acre perspective, where we might think of tender fruit as being highly, highly valuable, or muck vegetables in the marsh being highly valuable, these areas are even more exponentially valuable. Doesn't come without cost, challenge, and economic issues, and they very much do face those international markets. I think the unique thing there is that, again, back to this point, to sort of square this a little bit about how Canadians and our retail and wholesale structures see Canadian production. Oftentimes, our greenhouse sector is an exporter because that's where they can get the highest value for that product. It doesn't mean that we're not at the same time importing significant amounts of that same product, because we are, but it's a function of the value that businesses, Canadians, et cetera, see in the relative quality, et cetera. So again, I think in terms of trying to, help the horticultural sector, edible horticulture specific to this discussion, fit into this challenge, I think, again, this combination of marketing, value add, infrastructure on the cost perspective, and generally incentives to make sure that the land in the Greenbelt is in fact produced on, right? There's idle land in the Greenbelt, just like there's idle land across the rest of Ontario. And it's not because it's not protected, it's because people don't have the economic incentives to use it in that maximum use.
Well, and that's kind of a good segue, Steve, to a question in the chat that kind of gets at this cost benefit piece, right? And so the question says, the report and comments make it clear that the Greenbelt is producing benefits to Ontario and its citizens. But ask the question, are there costs that we're incurring to generate these benefits? And the return on investment calculus, what is the investment we're making to generate that return? So how do you think about kind of the full math around the cost benefit of the land, the protection, and what it means?
So, sorry, is that directed to me?
Yes, to you. We'll go to you first.
It's a difficult one, and I'll be frank, I've often used the adage, it's difficult to show that an acre of land with the Tim Hortons on it would be more valuable if it had an acre of farm production, because the math is pretty much impossible to do that. You're making an assessment that goes beyond just the pure, GDP and employment impacts. You're talking about other intrinsic value and recognizing that food security has a higher order priority, right? Just like land quality, land water quality, et cetera, might. Again, I think that's really key. I think what we haven't necessarily done is often thought about, the context of how we can better utilize land that maybe isn't suited for other things as well. That could apply again in the case of the clay belt. Yeah, you're not going to grow peaches up there, but there are things we could grow that would be a net positive benefit to agricultural production in different orders of magnitude. There's a lot of muckland up there, right? A significant amount, in fact. And so, again, it's that context, I think. I think that that's one of our challenges is we've tried to make these very much a mathematical discussion, and that has often meant that agriculture doesn't win.
And how do you think about that? Like, because it is often one of the problems that we've got is that they can be very mathematical, and these can also be very blunt tools, right? It is that you get into the space, and we're seeing it in some of the questions. It is either farmland or it is not, when we've already talked about some of the nuance around greenhouses or other forms of processing. Yeah. This is an issue in British Columbia where they don't let value-added processing onto their agricultural land reserve, right? And that's created this issue where you're not able to capture the value. And maybe we'll keep with you, Steve, and then we'll go to Amy and Gord on this. This is a complex issue. How do we manage that piece where kind of the math can be hard and then the policy tools can be limited when it comes to this? Steve, thoughts first?
Yeah, again, I think that one is to sort of recognize that food security, at least in today's context, is taking on a greater role, right? Again, I think the challenge for today is that we have it, for the most part, everybody alive has not went without. And that is a North American phenomenon at a level, but in reality, if you lived in Europe during World War II, you understand very well what going without means, and that's why the EU policy on agriculture is what it is. It's evolved since that time, but it's certainly largely based on this idea of food security is extremely important in a real way that most of us in Canada in today's generation, it would be difficult to really realize, right? And so I think that it starts with that. Secondarily, I think looking at agriculture, primary ag, food processing, et cetera, is critical industry, critical infrastructure is important. And again, there's a lot of discussion right now about what critical infrastructure means. There's some very heated discussions about that. As somebody that has farmland on the 401, I can appreciate what that means. So, you know what I mean? I think that there's nuance within that, but I think it's about thinking about farmland as something that's and farmland and processing infrastructure as critical infrastructure, I think is a pretty significant thing, and recognizing how important it is to be able to maintain that value chain and maintain food security.
And Amy, do you think that we do a good job of that when you think about the work that you do? You're in the space talking about food innovation, about food systems. Do you often think about it in the context of this as critical infrastructure that's needed? How do we manage that and think about that differently?
Well, we can think of what defines criticality if we consider that, again, as I mentioned, 1 in 8, 1 in 9 people working in this province are working in the agri-food sector. That's employment. That's a tax base. And so making sure that we've got quality employment is a really critical piece of this puzzle. And that runs the whole gamut. People working in grocery stores, people working in restaurants, people working in distribution, as well as processing. I just answered a comment in the Q&A because someone said, well, where did all of the fruit and vegetable processing go? And I think part of it, again, is awareness that once upon a time, if you go back several decades, we had a lot more small-scale regional processing facilities. Now we have centralized, large, highly efficient and modern processing facilities. But the other piece of the puzzle is that many of them are names that we don't recognize. Once upon a time, we all recognize, like there was a Del Monte plant in Niagara, but now it's SunOpta. And do people recognize the name SunOpta when they hear it? It's not a brand that people understand and face value. And so from that perspective, awareness of the different manufacturing that's out there is, I think, really critical. We've been, as a manufacturing sector, really hidden behind our own closed doors and not allowing the general public to understand and appreciate what goes on. But in the Q&A, I listed a whole bunch of names like Bonduelle and Highbury Canco. These are processors in Southern Ontario that no one's going to have name brand recognition outside of the actual manufacturing sector. people don't recognize these names, but they recognize Hunt's Ketchup. They recognize that's what was it? Hunt's Ketchup, I believe, is Select Foods in Toronto. Um, Many of these processors, the actual naming of the company is not the name that you see on the package, and therefore the general consumer is not able to make that connection. For example, Innovata Foods down in Tilsonburg area, you're never going to see a package that says Innovata, but uh, they do a lot of frozen product, including some frozen, flash frozen IQF frozen fruits and vegetables. Bonduelle is another one that no one's going to recognize the name. How do we make sure that we do not become our worst enemy by not allowing people to know and have have a sense of the scale of what we're doing?
I mean, that's an interesting question, Amy, or comment, Amy, because again, I think this goes back to this is a value chain piece too, right? A lot of people have this image of farmers, but when they go to the grocery store, they're not actually purchasing something from the farm, right? They're purchasing something with a brand name on it. Maybe I guess pick on peaches again. Maybe they're hopefully purchasing peaches with a Foodland Ontario logo that's on the basket. Um, uh, but how much of that like is that? Are we getting more disconnected, or do people actually understand and value that, or is that something that's different?
I would argue that we are extremely disconnected. So, for example, that basket of peaches, it's not coming off of the back of a farmer's truck into your local grocery store. It's going to a packing house that has Global Food Safety Initiative benchmarked HACCP programs, food safety programs for those of you who are not specialists. They have quality assurance specialists who are ensuring that this product is meeting quality standards. And then there's an aspect of cold storage, and that is quite technologically advanced, that we are not just getting peaches just for the very, very short couple weeks of the window of August that they're available. We have immense amount of technology that's allowing us to experience these products through an extended shelf life and being able to distribute them across the country in a meaningful way so that we're enjoying the freshness and the quality that the farmers have put in. And so we really don't have a strong appreciation as a general public for the amount of technology that goes into growing, let's say it's closed environment agriculture lettuce. There's a number of different facilities that are now doing these products because of the shift in demand from the US geopolitics, as well as issues with the Salinas Valley causing E. coli contamination. Um, there's a huge amount of technology that goes into it. It looks like you're getting a box of lettuce, but no, making sure that the hygiene is really high, the any sort of food safety and quality assurance, extension of shelf life, these are all extremely technological interventions that the agri-food system is applying so that we can have a high quality product on our table every day.
Right, Gordon, Amy touches on something that again I don't think isn't covered in the report necessarily, but when you look at kind of this global production of or sorry, not greenhouse, of fruit and vegetables, we do hear these stories, right, where kind of this production is getting squeezed, water that has been so key to U.S. production seems to be coming in short supply in ways that it hasn't been in the past. Um, like if you think ahead in the 5 to 10 years, what is that going to look like, do you think? And how concerned, I guess, should we be about fruit and vegetable production globally, and how much are the trade patterns that feed Canadian consumers going to change, do you think?
Oh, I'm not a good person to use crystal ball, but I mean, I think in terms of trade patterns, I think we're going to continue facing, import competition, whether it's, I mean, California, there are issues, that pop up in different regions, basically every year and causing pressures. And I, a large retailer, I just saw a bulletin from them from this morning that basically blamed the higher prices at the retail shelves as a result of what's going on, in California. I mean, the water issues there is going to continue to be an issue. I think where that goes is I think it's more up to us more than it is up to the other regions. if as a society and an economy and with policymakers, if we can create that environment here in Ontario, in and out of the Greenbelt to strengthen our production and so on, and make ourselves competitive in comparison to those regions, especially those regions where there is less and less stability of supply and there which creates price and supply shocks. Then we're all going to benefit from that. And but it is a challenge though, because at the consolidated retail level, there is I think I can say that there maybe is a bit of short-sightedness in terms of they talk about supporting local, and they definitely buy local, but they use regardless of where they're buying, they're using that potential savings, lower price from other regions as a way to pressure those prices here locally, which then impacts the willingness and ability of the growers and the production here at home to continue to expand, to invest in the innovation that Amy was talking about. And I think that's where we're going to get hung up, is if there isn't that, I'll call it incentive, and funds available to be able to invest in and innovate, that 10-year opportunity will disappear, and it will go to other countries or other regions that have facilitated a sort of a more stable economic environment for their growers.
So Steve, we'll kind of go to you on kind of a forward-thinking question, but we'll bring Ed and Margaret in to get on this too. I guess I'm curious, Steve, like, how do you think about how this has changed or is going to change over the next 5 and 10 years, and how much of your thinking about the change is impacted by kind of chaos in the world today, and how much of it is kind of long-term forces that have been underway anyways?
Well, I think that from the perspective of what we've seen in the last 5 years, whether it's COVID or now, what's going on geopolitically, the idea that we should think a little closer about food security from a production perspective, I think it kind of, from my perspective, goes without saying. I think how we accomplish that is tricky, given that we are still, subject to international competition. I think, to Gordon's point, and I've been saying this for quite a while now, the reasons that the U.S. overtook us in horticultural production in a lot of ways had a lot to do with agronomic advantages they had, and significant scale that is part of the nature of their industry, and the advantages that affords them are going away pretty rapidly, to the point that it's not to suggest that we're uber competitive with them, but certainly that gap is narrowed, and the ability for us in an environment where Canadians recognize the value of a Canadian product in a way that goes beyond excuse me, price, I think, was really significant. So, to Gordon's point, I think understanding that this requires infrastructure being producers, people that want to produce horticultural crops, the technology, the varieties, the land, right? Or the indoor space, right? Greenhouse tomatoes being a really good example. Those are things that I think we really need to take a hold of. All of those are products that we import significant volumes of. All of them are things that we could likely displace if we had the production. And I think, again, it's a different kind of context than what we would have seen, again, 30 years ago, where we had production, but we were making an economic choice to buy from somebody who offered at that time arguably an equal quality, but a much lower price. So I think that has changed quite a bit, and that's the driving force. How do we get the infrastructure and incentives in people's hands to do it, given all the challenges that we've talked about, is there. But again, the Greenbelt as an example, with smaller landholding, et cetera, it's not like you have to go and buy 100 acres to be a competitive horticultural producer in many commodities. 30 acres, which is kind of one of the average sized parcels, is well suited to this type of production, and quite honestly is still a pretty scalable or a pretty sizable farm for certain commodities, right? So I think that's just something that we have to continue changing mindsets on. And again, just to finish, programs like there is at Niagara College or some of the other colleges around Ontario that are helping students in a practical sense get into some of these, more interesting, if you will, non-traditional agriculture commodities, I think is quite valuable. And again, recognizing that most of these students are not from an ag background, and that's why, again, it goes to this idea of how do you bring people into the sector, and that's a major factor for making the sector move forward.
Thanks, Steve. So Amy, let's go to you next. In the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think about the pressures that are changing, and what do we need to be doing?
I like how Stephen prefaced it that succession planning and bringing youth into agricultural careers is going to be absolutely critical, because right now Margaret put it very nicely in her report that we're sitting at this looming precipice that most of the agricultural workforce is in their 50s and 60s. And again, unless we have young people who are excited about entering into any number of the jobs that are available within the value chain, we are going to be facing an escarpment potentially. Now, how do we do this? Inevitably, part of it's got to be financing, because people cannot afford to be going out and purchasing agricultural land. And so we have to think really creatively. Is it through government programs? Is it through private sector? I'm not sure. I'm not an economist. But I think that's going to be part of the situation. Another part will be the labor aspect. Agriculture work is physically demanding, and food processing equally very physically demanding. We have to ask questions about automation and technology and its appropriate utilization to be able to allow people to work extremely efficiently and effectively on the land or within the processing that they're doing. And of course, the other piece of the puzzle is appreciating the overall value for the food within our community. And so I think we as a sector have to do a better job telling our stories and making sure that the general public, the voting public, understands what we do within agriculture and food systems, so that they then go and vote and make decisions about purchasing things from Ontario, purchasing things that have local branding, to be able to then say, my dollar is going back into this, voting so that they're protecting the critical systems that are making our community unique and making our communities vibrant and beautiful.
Great.
Thank you, Amy. Gordon, next 5 to 10 years, what do you think about the pressures? What do you think about the opportunities?
Well, uh, I think there's opportunities for that critical infrastructure investment. I mean, I think it was touched on already, but we've got farms that they've been able to put in, some modern packing facilities, whether it's for potatoes or other things. But they're running diesel generators to be able to access sufficient energy for it, and it was hard to pencil that out before the fuel price shocks of the last month, and now it doesn't really pencil at all. But they're in it. The broader investment is going to require that they continue, or certainly hope they do. But so there's that critical infrastructure piece. Amy talked about that innovation and that automation. Certainly a lot of work has gone into that, and a lot more work can happen with that. There will still be a need for physical labor for many jobs for a long time. But certainly opportunities there. The next generation piece is really that's a nut that I'm not quite sure how we can crack that one, but I do feel that if there's sufficient if the business is attractive enough to get into, and that there's ability to, that people can bank on its ability to return, and that people aren't going to lose their shirts over it, there will be a next generation that'll be interested. We are going to continue seeing larger farms, though, and I don't personally think that that's necessarily, if that's all we're seeing, I think that might be a concern. Having a mixture of large and small is going to be important, I think, in terms of longevity. But I'll leave it with that.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. And Margaret, what about you? What do you see in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think people have already talked about it. I mean, we know that the future of the workforce is really important, and that with the aging producers, and are we attracting enough young people into the industry, and can they afford the land? Surely there should be some innovative ways of allowing them to learn about farming while they're perhaps over a longer period of mortgage or something. There should be some innovative ways, and hopefully banks or the Farm Credit Canada I have programs for young farmers. Quebec has a very good program called La Relève. Now, of course, it's not the same value of land, but surely there should be. And I think our Niagara Institute, the universities, the colleges have a role to play in making it appear attractive, attracting young people. Certainly, when I was at a recent Ontario Farmland Trust webinar, I met immigrants, new students that had come from other countries who were already knew about agriculture and wanted to get into agriculture in Ontario. And so perhaps that's another source. And just making consumers, voters, aware of the value of our sector and the future for the sovereignty. I think this is a really good time, given what we've seen with people wanting to buy local, looking for homegrown things. Small is beautiful. Agritourism, urban agriculture. Surely these things can be developed more. It's not just one size fits all. So that over the next 10 years we can maintain and develop these things of different sizes that are locally produced and from in our region.
Thank you, Margaret, and encourage everyone to check out the report that Margaret prepared that informs some of this discussion. Ed, we'll go to you, but before I ask you, but then kind of your thoughts in the next 5 to 10 years, I want to ask you 2 questions that have come up in the chat in the Q&A a couple of times. One on the kind of the private land. How much of the Greenbelt land is privately held land?
Vast majority of Greenbelt agricultural land would be private land.
Right,
Vast majority.
And this is probably a very loaded question, but I'll ask it.
Yeah.
What's the acreage of land that's held by speculators, and how do you think about the role of speculators in Greenbelt land?
We don't know, exact numbers. It's, some have tried to sort of assess that for different purposes. It becomes very complicated. We've seen across North America that lots of real estate investment trusts, others have bought up land around all urban centers, and that is also true in Southern Ontario. And the challenge with that is that land speculation is not a value-added economic activity. It has the effect of, in many cases, denuding the natural landscape. Often land is, row hedges, other things are, cut down, and the land then generally becomes leased land to take advantage of tax advantages. And that means that there's not high value-added agriculture going on this land. And then there's immense pressures on land conversion, whether it's in the Greenbelt or other near urban areas, to convert land from agriculture. So there's a whole, myriad of issues with it. I think things like the Greenbelt that really present the fact that this land should be seen as permanent in terms of permanently agricultural is hopefully a somewhat of a, inoculates against encouraging land speculation, which really doesn't, again, provide economic value, and in fact stultifies much of what is the agri-food opportunity in these areas.
Right.
Just speaking very frankly.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm sure that's a kind of a challenging piece when it's often hard to understand really what's going on here. But so let's go back, Ed, to that kind of question I asked everyone else. When you look at the Greenbelt, when you look at the next 5 to 10 years, when you look at some of the things that are on your horizon, what do you see as the pressures, and what do you see as the opportunities that are out there?
Yeah, and I won't repeat what others have said so smartly. So maybe just to focus on like this competing land issue. We're growing in so many ways. In Ontario, we're seeing, demand for energy storage, energy production, all of which are impacting, agricultural lands, among many other things. So need to really be thinking seriously about land use. And second, global risks. I don't think most of us would imagine that in the next 5 and 10 years, we're suddenly going to, turn a corner immediately on immense risk, whether those are geopolitical, climate, other sorts of factors. So that really just then invites us to look back to what is the opportunity, what's the unique advantages in Southern Ontario, in the Greenbelt region, as it relates to something that's really has an immense amount of potential, is so important from a whole variety of perspectives: food sovereignty, community economic development, things that are maybe in some cases where we can improve import substitution, they're tariff resistant type of economic activities. So, in the face of so much insecurity, and in the face of things we can't control globally, what can we control and what do we have here? Would be really focused on that in a serious way. And thinking about it in a much more integrated way to say, where do we want to be in 5 to 10 years from an agri-food perspective, and then build, a serious industrial or, sector-based strategy to get there. We've seen, examples of that provincially and with the Barton report a number of years ago federally, but we need to really live into those things. And then to make the investments, the policy choices that move us forward to that positive future outcome.
I'm just curious that how different do you think that your answer would have been 2 or 3 years ago? Like I can't imagine you were talking about tariff resistant at the time. I know that that's changed a lot of the work that we do, but how much has it changed how you think about the green belt?
We've been at this issue though of like what's the unrealized potential in agri-food in Southern Ontario for a long time. So whether it's the tariffs that just sort of add like an enhanced amount of kind of pressure and make the sort of intrinsic opportunity we have more valuable. This has been true for a long time, that we have unmet potential here, things that can really create great advantages to us in a whole variety of ways. But you're right. I mean, it just tariffs and geopolitical uncertainty, even COVID that disrupted supply chains, have just further accentuated this desire to create independence and where we can, protect ourselves. And I think that's sort of what the latest round of things is just further underscoring.
Well, I think that that's a good note to end on. I think that that is a good call to action. We do need more of those. I think to your point, a lot of these things we've been talking about for a long time. We're doing some things, but there's a lot more than we can do. One thing I can do is thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you to Ed and to Margaret, as well as to our panelists, Amy, Gord, and Steve. Appreciate your contributions today. This is clearly an important topic, and it's something that's in the news, will continue to be in the news, and we think is a really important piece that's there. And thank you to the Greenbelt Foundation for supporting the report and for supporting the webinar. Today, we enjoyed the partnership. And again, I think I often say land use is kind of the elephant in the room in a lot of ag policy discussions. It's something that we often don't think about. But as you say, all of these pressures that are going on just give us more and more reason to talk about it every day. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to the participants for watching today. Have a great day.
Thank you.